Cowboys earned reward. Adelaide Addie West had sworn never to trust a man again, but when she found herself stranded with Red Dawson, a gunfighter with nothing left to lose, she had no choice. He sat by the fire, watching her, his voice low. "You're scared of me," he murmured. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight. If this table of contents meets with your approval, I'm ready to proceed." Chapter 1. The Desert's Cruel Embrace. The sun, a merciless eye in the vast, cloudless sky, beat down upon Adelaide Addie West. Sweat trickled down her temples, mingling with the dust that coated her skin, turning it the color of the parched earth beneath her worn boots. Her throat was dry, a scratchy, desperate kind of dry that made swallowing feel like dragging sandpaper across raw flesh. The once vibrant blue of her calico dress was faded and stained, clinging to her damp skin like a second, unwelcome layer. Beside her, the carcass of her horse, Belle, lay bloated and still, a grim testament to the desert's unforgiving nature. Flies buzzed lazily around the animal, a constant, irritating drone that underscored the silence of the vast, empty landscape. Addie knelt, her stiff joints protesting with a low groan, and ran a trembling hand over Belle's matted mane. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, threatened to overwhelm her. Belle had been more than just a horse. She had been a companion, a steady presence in a life that had been anything but. "Oh, Belle," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm so sorry." She had been foolish, so terribly foolish, to think she could make this journey alone. The letter from her sister, Clara, had been so urgent, so full of barely concealed desperation, that Addie had thrown caution to the wind. "Come quickly, Addie. I need you." The words had echoed in her mind, driving her forward, blinding her to the risks. Now, stranded miles from anywhere, with only the vultures circling overhead for company, the weight of her folly pressed down on her like the oppressive heat. She closed her eyes, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. Crying wouldn't help. It wouldn't bring Belle back, wouldn't magically conjure water or shelter. Survival, she knew, demanded a clear head and a steady hand. She had learned that lesson the hard way, years ago, when a different kind of desert, a desert of the heart, had nearly consumed her. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Addie forced herself to stand. She surveyed the horizon, her gaze sweeping across the endless expanse of sand, rock, and scrub brush. Nothing. Just the shimmering heat haze dancing above the cracked earth, mocking her with the illusion of water. She had a small canteen, nearly empty, and a few strips of dried beef in her saddlebag. Enough, perhaps, for a day, maybe two if she rationed carefully. But after that she pushed the thought away. One step at a time. That was all she could do. One step at a time, and pray for a miracle. She salvaged what she could from Belle's saddlebags. The canteen, the beef, a small, worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a Winchester rifle, its stock smooth and familiar beneath her touch. The rifle was heavy, a burden in her weakened state, but she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. It represented security, a fragile shield against the dangers that lurked in this desolate land. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert, Addie started walking west, towards the setting sun, towards the faint hope that she might stumble upon a road, a town, some sign of civilization. Each step was an agony, her muscles screaming in protest, her boots sinking into the loose sand. But she pressed on, driven by a stubborn refusal to give up. The light faded, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and deep, bruised blue. The air, though still warm, held a hint of coolness, a welcome respite from the day's scorching heat. Addie found a small, rocky outcrop, offering a modicum of shelter from the wind, and sank down, leaning her back against the cool stone. She took a tiny sip of water, savoring the precious liquid, and gnawed on a strip of beef. As darkness enveloped her, the desert came alive with sound. The mournful howl of a coyote echoed in the distance, followed by the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Fear, cold and clammy, tightened its grip on her. She clutched the rifle, her knuckles white, her senses on high alert. It was then that she heard it, the soft, rhythmic thud of hooves, approaching slowly but steadily. Her heart leaped into her throat. Hope, fragile and tentative, flickered within her. But hope, she knew, could be a dangerous thing in this land. It could blind you to the truth, make you vulnerable. The rider emerged from the darkness, a silhouette against the starlit sky. A tall, lean figure on a large, dark horse. Addie held her breath, her hand tightening on the rifle. She couldn't make out his features, but she could sense his presence, a palpable force that radiated both danger and something else. Something she couldn't quite define. He reined in his horse a few yards away, the animal snorting and pawing the ground. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the frantic beating of Addie's heart. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. "Lost, are you?" Addie hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to trust anyone, not out here. But she also couldn't afford to be alone. "My horse," she died. She managed, her voice barely a whisper. The rider dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, despite his size. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the sand. As he drew closer, the moonlight illuminated his face. It was a hard face, weathered and lined, with a strong jaw and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. A scar, jagged and pale, bisected his left eyebrow, a silent testament to a life lived on the edge. He was a gunfighter, she realized with a jolt, the kind of man who lived by his wits and his gun. The kind of man she had sworn to avoid at all costs. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her disheveled appearance, her desperate situation. "Name's Rhett Dawson," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "And you are?" "Adelaide West," she replied, her voice still shaky. He nodded, his eyes lingering on the rifle in her hands. "You know how to use that thing?" Addie met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "I do." A flicker of something respect, perhaps, crossed his face. He glanced back at the carcass of her horse, then back at her. "You're a long way from anywhere, Miss West. And night's coming on fast." She knew that. She didn't need him to tell her. But his words, spoken in that low, calm voice, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Fear, and a strange, unsettling awareness of his presence. He sat down by a small, scraggly bush, a few feet away from her, and began to gather dry twigs and branches. "Might as well make a fire," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Keep the coyotes away. And the cold." Addie watched him, her mind still reeling. She didn't trust him. She couldn't trust him. But she had no choice. She was stranded, alone, and vulnerable. And he, for all his dangerous aura, was her only hope. He built the fire quickly and efficiently, his movements practiced and sure. The flames leaped to life, casting a warm, flickering glow that pushed back the darkness. Rhett Dawson sat by the fire, watching her, his expression unreadable. He was close enough that she caught the scent of him, a mix of leather, horse sweat, and something else, something wild and untamed that made her breath catch in her throat. "You're scared of me," he murmured, his voice low, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of her precarious position, and the unsettling truth that her survival now rested in the hands of this enigmatic, dangerous stranger. Chapter 2. An Unwelcome Companion. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the inky blackness above. The warmth was a welcome relief against the growing chill of the desert night, but it did little to ease the knot of tension in Addie's stomach. She sat stiffly, her back against the rock, the rifle still clutched in her hands. Rhett Dawson hadn't made any threatening moves, hadn't said anything further, but his very presence was a threat. He was an unknown, a wild card in a situation already fraught with peril. He seemed content to let the silence stretch, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Addie studied him surreptitiously, trying to glean some understanding of the man from his appearance. He was dressed in the practical garb of a working cowboy, worn denim pants, a faded chambray shirt, scuffed boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. A gun belt, low slung on his hips, held a Colt Peacemaker, its handle worn smooth from use. He looked every inch the hardened frontiersman, a man who had seen his share of hardship and violence. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low and unhurried. "You heading somewhere in particular, Miss West?" Addie hesitated, weighing her options. Honesty was a luxury she couldn't afford, not out here. But outright lies could be dangerous, too. "My sister," she said, choosing her words carefully.
"She needs me."
He raised an eyebrow, the scar above it making the gesture seem almost skeptical. "And where might your sister be?" "West Creek," she replied, naming a small town several days' ride from their current location. It was the truth, at least partially. Clara was in West Creek, but Addie had no idea what awaited her there. Only that urgent, desperate letter. Rhett nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "Long ride, especially without a horse." "I know," Addie said, her voice tight. She didn't need him to state the obvious. He reached into his saddlebag, which lay beside him, and pulled out a tin cup and a battered coffee pot. He poured water from his canteen into the pot and set it on the edge of the fire. "Coffee?" he offered, without looking at her. Addie shook her head. "No, thank you." She didn't want to be indebted to him, even in such a small way. He shrugged and poured himself a cup, the aroma of strong, black coffee filling the air. He took a long sip, his eyes closing briefly, as if savoring the moment. Addie found herself watching him, mesmerized by the way the firelight played across his features, highlighting the harsh angles and planes of his face. He was a handsome man, she realized, in a rough, rugged sort of way. But it was a dangerous kind of beauty, the kind that could lure you in and then leave you shattered. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" he asked, his voice breaking into her thoughts. Addie bristled. "What makes you say that?" He gave a slight smile, a fleeting expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't strike me as the kind of woman who spends much time in the desert." She didn't reply, unwilling to reveal anything more about herself. He was right, of course. She had grown up in a comfortable home, surrounded by family and friends. But that life had been ripped away from her, leaving her adrift in a world that felt increasingly hostile. He finished his coffee and set the cup aside. "You planning on staying awake all night, Miss West?" Addie glanced at the rifle in her hands. "I'll manage." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "I admire your grit, but you'll be no good to anyone if you're too tired to stand. I'll keep watch. You get some sleep." She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to refuse. Trusting him was out of the question. But exhaustion was creeping in, a heavy weight on her eyelids. She was so tired, so bone-weary, that she could barely think straight. She began, then stopped. He met her gaze, his blue eyes surprisingly gentle. "I gave you my word, Miss West. I won't harm you. I may be a lot of things, but I'm not a liar." His word. What weight has the word from a man, a gunfighter? It's all she has to choose. She knew she was taking a risk, a huge risk. But she was also at the end of her rope. She needed to sleep, to regain some strength, if she had any hope of surviving this ordeal. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But if you..." He held up a hand, silencing her. "Just sleep, Miss West. I'll wake you before dawn." Addie reluctantly lowered the rifle, setting it beside her within easy reach. She curled up on the ground, using her saddlebag as a pillow. The hard earth was uncomfortable, but she was too tired to care. She closed her eyes, listening to the crackling of the fire and the steady breathing of the man beside her. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and uneasy. She dreamt of dark shadows and menacing figures, of whispers and gunshots. She woke several times with a start, her heart pounding, her hand reaching for the rifle. Each time, she saw Rhett Dawson sitting by the fire, his back to her, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the circle of light. He seemed to be a permanent fixture in the night, a silent, watchful guardian, or a patient predator. She couldn't decide which. As the first faint streaks of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Addie drifted into a deeper sleep. This time, her dreams were different. She dreamt of a wide, open field, bathed in sunlight. She was running, laughing, her hair streaming behind her. And beside her, running with her, was a tall, dark-haired man. She couldn't see his face, but she felt his presence, strong and reassuring. A sense of peace, of belonging, washed over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. A gentle shake woke her. She opened her eyes, blinking against the growing light. Rhett Dawson was kneeling beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Time to rise, Miss West," he said, his voice soft. "The sun's coming up." His proximity made Addie's heart flutter, a new wave of confusion setting in. Addie sat up, pushing the remnants of the dream away. The reality of her situation crashed down on her, the fear and uncertainty returning with full force. She was still stranded in the desert, with a man she didn't trust, a man who held her fate in his hands. The dream, she realized, was just that, a dream. A cruel reminder of what she had lost, and what she might never have again. The weight of it settled, a heavy feeling deep in her soul, as she wondered what new dangers this day would bring, with the sun rising on this unwelcome companionship. Chapter 3. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. The desert dawn was a spectacle of muted colors, soft pinks and oranges gradually giving way to the harsh, bright glare of the rising sun. The air was still cool, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. Rhett Dawson had already packed his gear, his horse saddled, and ready to go. He stood silently, watching Addie as she gathered her meager belongings. "We should get moving," he said, his voice neutral. "Water's precious, and we've got a long way to go." Addie nodded, avoiding his gaze. She felt awkward and vulnerable, acutely aware of her dependence on him. She strapped her saddlebag to her back, the weight of the rifle a familiar comfort. They walked in silence, Rhett leading his horse, Addie trailing behind. The landscape was unchanging, a vast expanse of sand and rock stretching out in every direction. The only sound was the soft thud of their boots and the occasional snort of the horse. Addie found herself studying Rhett's back, trying to decipher the man from his posture, his gait. He walked with a confident, almost arrogant stride, his shoulders squared, his head held high. He seemed completely at ease in this harsh environment, as if he belonged here. As the sun climbed higher, the heat intensified. Addie's throat grew parched, her lips cracked and dry. She rationed her water carefully, taking small sips that did little to quench her thirst. "We'll stop for a rest at midday," Rhett said, breaking the silence. "There's a small canyon up ahead, with a bit of shade." Addie simply nodded, conserving her energy. She was grateful for the promise of respite, however brief. They reached the canyon around noon. It was a narrow, winding crevice in the rock, offering a welcome escape from the relentless sun. A few scraggly trees clung to the canyon walls, providing a semblance of shade. Rhett unsaddled his horse, letting it graze on the sparse vegetation. He built a small fire, using dry twigs and branches he gathered from the canyon floor. Addie sat down heavily, leaning her back against the cool rock. He offered her some jerky, which she accepted gratefully. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. "So, Miss West," Rhett said, "finally, what brings you out to this godforsaken country?" Addie hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I told you my sister needs me." He raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "And what kind of trouble is your sister in?" She bristled at his tone. "That's none of your business." He shrugged, seemingly unconcerned by her defensiveness. "Suit yourself. But out here, secrets can be dangerous." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn book. He opened it and began to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. Addie watched him, curious. It seemed incongruous, this hardened gunfighter reading a book in the middle of the desert. "What are you reading?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. He looked up, surprised by her question. Just some poetry, he replied, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. Poetry? Addie was taken aback. It didn't fit with her image of him, this rough, dangerous man. It suggested a depth, a sensitivity, that she hadn't expected. He closed the book, marking his place with a thin strip of leather. My mother used to read to me, he said, his voice softer than usual. She loved poetry. Addie found herself wanting to know more, to understand the man behind the facade. But she held back, afraid of revealing too much of herself. They rested in the canyon for several hours, the silence between them punctuated by the occasional snap of the fire and the distant cry of a hawk. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows lengthened, and the air began to cool. Time to move on, Rhett said, rising to his feet. He saddled his horse, his movements efficient and practiced. Addie stood up, her joints stiff and aching. She felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of danger. The silence of the desert, which had once seemed peaceful, now felt oppressive, filled with unspoken threats. They set off again, walking westward, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows before them. The landscape grew increasingly rugged, the terrain more difficult to navigate. Suddenly, Rhett stopped, his hand raised in a signal for silence. He listened intently, his eyes scanning the horizon. What is it? Addie whispered, her heart pounding. Riders, he replied, his voice low and tense. 2, maybe 3. Coming this way. Fear gripped Addie, cold and paralyzing. She clutched the rifle, her hands trembling. Get down, Rhett ordered, pushing her towards a cluster of rocks. He dismounted, his movements swift and decisive. He drew his Colt, his eyes narrowed, his body taut with readiness. The sound of approaching hooves grew louder, closer. Addie crouched behind the rocks, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She could see Rhett, standing in the open, his gun trained on the approaching riders. The riders emerged from behind a rocky outcrop, their faces obscured by the shadows. They were rough-looking men, heavily armed, their horses lathered and weary. Outlaws, Addie realized with a jolt of terror. Hold it right there, Rhett called out, his voice ringing with authority. The riders reined in their horses, their eyes narrowed, their hands hovering near their guns. What do you want? One of the riders demanded, his voice gruff and menacing. Just passing through, Rhett replied, his voice calm and steady. No trouble. The riders exchanged glances, their suspicion evident. We don't like strangers in these parts, the leader said. We're not looking for trouble, Rhett repeated, his grip tightening on his Colt. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. Addie held her breath, her finger tightening on the trigger of her rifle. She knew that one wrong move, one misplaced word, could lead to bloodshed. Suddenly, one of the riders recognized Rhett. Dawson? He exclaimed, his voice filled with surprise and a hint of fear. Rhett Dawson? Rhett nodded, his eyes never leaving the riders. That's right. The riders exchanged another look, this one filled with uncertainty. They had heard of Rhett Dawson, the legendary gunfighter, the man who had single-handedly taken down the notorious Black Bart gang. We didn't know it was you, the leader stammered, his bravado fading. Just move along, Rhett said, his voice cold and hard. And we'll forget this ever happened. The riders hesitated for a moment, then, without a word, turned their horses and rode away, disappearing back into the vastness of the desert. Addie let out a long, shaky breath, her body trembling with relief. She had been so close to death, so close to a violent confrontation. And it was Rhett Dawson, the man she had feared and distrusted, who had saved her. The echoes of what could have been, the gunfire that didn't ring out, the bloodshed that was avoided, left a ringing silence in their wake, a stark reminder of the precariousness of their journey and the volatile nature of the man who is now, undeniably, her protector. Chapter 4. The Weight of a Stranger's Oath. The encounter with the outlaws left Addie shaken. The near violence had shattered the fragile sense of calm that had settled between her and Rhett. She watched him carefully as he reholstered his Colt, his movements deliberate and controlled. He seemed unfazed by the confrontation, as if it were just another day in his life. "Thank you," she said, her voice still trembling slightly. "You saved my life." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, just doing what needed to be done. Addie wanted to believe him, to trust in his seemingly casual heroism, but the memory of his reputation, the whispers of his past, lingered in her mind. He was a gunfighter, a man who lived by violence. How could she be sure that he wouldn't turn on her, that he wasn't simply using her for his own purposes? They continued their journey in silence, the tension between them palpable. Addie walked a little further behind him now, her hand never far from her rifle. The sun beat down mercilessly, the heat radiating off the rocks and sand. As the day wore on, Addie's thoughts kept returning to the outlaws. Their fear of Red Dawson had been obvious. What had he done to earn such a reputation? What darkness lurked in his past? She stole glances at him, trying to decipher the man from his face, his demeanor. He was an enigma, a closed book. And yet, she couldn't deny the strange sense of security she felt in his presence. He was dangerous, yes, but he was also capable, strong, and surprisingly gentle. "Why did they fear you?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I have a reputation," he said, his voice flat. "A reputation for what?" Addie pressed, her curiosity overcoming her caution. He stopped, turning to face her. His blue eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. "Pain? Regret?" "For killing," he said, his voice low and harsh. "For being faster, deadlier than most." Addie shivered, despite the heat. His words confirmed her worst fears. He was a killer, a man who had taken lives. But there was something more in his voice, a hint of weariness, of self-loathing, that made her question her assumptions. Have you killed many men?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, his jaw tight. "Too many," he said, his voice barely audible. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Addie didn't know what to say. She wanted to condemn him, to recoil from his confession. But she couldn't. She had seen the fear in the outlaw's eyes, the respect, however grudging. She had seen his skill, his courage, his willingness to protect her. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why did you choose this life?" He turned back to her, his eyes searching hers. "I didn't choose it," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "It chose me." He didn't elaborate, and Addie didn't press him. She sensed that he was carrying a heavy burden, a weight of past actions and regrets that he couldn't escape. They continued walking, the silence between them no longer tense, but filled with a strange, unspoken understanding. Addie realized that she was beginning to see him differently, to see beyond the reputation, the gunfighter image. He was a complex man, flawed and damaged, but also capable of kindness, of compassion. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, Rhett stopped near a small, rocky outcrop. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. Addie nodded, grateful for the respite. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He built a fire, his movements efficient and practiced. They ate in silence, sharing the last of the jerky and a small amount of water. As darkness fell, Addie found herself watching Rhett, her gaze drawn to his strong hands, his weathered face, his piercing blue eyes. She felt a strange stirring within her, a mixture of fear and fascination. She was drawn to him, despite her better judgment, despite the danger he represented. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice soft in the stillness of the night. He looked up, surprised by her question. "I gave you my word," he said, his voice simple and direct. "But why?" Addie persisted. "You don't even know me." He met her gaze, his eyes holding a depth of emotion she couldn't fathom. "Maybe I see something in you worth saving," he said, his voice low and husky. "Something I lost a long time ago." Addie stares at him, completely captured by his words. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Addie felt a blush rise to her cheeks, A warmth spread through her chest. She was confused, uncertain, but also strangely moved. She had sworn never to trust a man again, to guard her heart against further pain. But Rhett Dawson was challenging her resolve, chipping away at the walls she had built around herself. He was a stranger, a gunfighter, a man with a dark past. But he had also shown her kindness, protection, and a glimpse of a soul that was both wounded and yearning. The weight of his oath, the promise he had made to keep her safe, felt heavy and real and surprisingly comforting, even as it mingled with the ever-present fear of the unknown path that lay ahead. Chapter 5. Beneath a sky of endless stars. The night was clear and cold, the desert air crisp and clean. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, reddish glow on the surrounding rocks. Above, the sky was a breathtaking tapestry of stars, countless pinpricks of light scattered across the vast, inky blackness. Addie lay wrapped in her blanket, gazing up at the celestial display, her mind awhirl with conflicting emotions. Rhett's words from earlier echoed in her thoughts. Maybe I see something in you worth saving. Something I lost a long time ago. What had he meant by that? What did he see in her? And what had he lost? She stole a glance at him. He was sitting by the fire, his back to her, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the embers. She wondered what he was thinking, what demons he battled in the silence of the night. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional crackle of the dying fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Addie felt a strange sense of peace, despite her precarious situation. The vastness of the desert, the beauty of the night sky, seemed to dwarf her worries, her fears. She had always loved the stars. As a child, she had spent countless hours lying on her back, gazing up at the heavens, imagining the stories behind each constellation. Her mother had taught her the names of the stars, the myths and legends associated with them. "Do you know the stars?" she asked, her voice soft in the darkness. Rhett turned his head, surprised by her question. "Some," he replied. "Enough to find my way. My mother taught me," Addie said. She said the stars were like stories, written in the sky. He nodded, his gaze returning to the embers. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was, Addie said, a pang of sadness hitting her. She missed her mother, her gentle wisdom, her unwavering love. They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. Addie continued to gaze at the stars, finding comfort in their timeless beauty. She felt a strange connection to Rhett, a shared sense of solitude, of being lost in this vast, unforgiving landscape. "What did you lose?" she asked, finally, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. She thought he might ignore her question, but then he spoke, his voice low and strained. "Hope," he said. "Innocence. The belief that the world was a good place." Addie felt a lump form in her throat. She understood his words, his pain. She, too, had lost those things years ago when her life had been shattered by betrayal and heartbreak. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine empathy. He shrugged, his shoulders slumping. "It's the way of the world, I guess. Especially out here." "Not always," Addie said, her voice firm. "There's still good in the world. There has to be." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you really believe that?" Addie met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "I have to," she said. "Otherwise, what's the point?" He held her gaze for a long moment, then looked away, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher crossing his face. Was it hope? Or simply disbelief? "You're a strange woman, Adelaide West," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "And you're a strange man, Rhett Dawson," she replied, a matching smile touching her own lips. The tension between them eased, replaced by a fragile sense of camaraderie. They sat in silence for a while longer, gazing up at the stars, the vastness of the universe a silent witness to their shared vulnerability. Addie felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something akin to it, a connection, a spark of hope in the darkness. As the night wore on, the fire died down completely, leaving them in almost total darkness. The only light came from the stars, their faint glow illuminating Rhett's face. He was watching her, she realized, his eyes intense and unreadable. She felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and anticipation. She was drawn to him, to his strength, his vulnerability, his hidden depths. But she was also afraid of opening her heart again, of risking further pain. He reached out, his hand gently touching hers. The contact was electric, sending a jolt of awareness through her. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Get some sleep, Addie," he said, his voice low and husky. "We've got a long day ahead of us." Addie nodded, unable to speak. She lay back down, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. She was too aware of his presence, of his hand still resting lightly on hers. She lay there for what seemed like hours, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the warmth of his hand on hers. She was confused, uncertain, but also strangely exhilarated. She had sworn never to trust a man again, but Rhett Dawson was breaking down her defenses, one star, one touch, one whispered word at a time. The vast, endless sky above them seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, as Addie drifted on the edge of sleep, caught between the fear of the past and the fragile, uncertain promise of a future she could no longer deny was beginning to intertwine with the fate of the man beside her. Chapter 6. Scars of the Past, Whispers of the Future. The first rays of dawn painted the sky with streaks of pale pink and orange. Addie woke with a start, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle. She had fallen asleep with Rhett's hand still touching hers, and the memory of that contact sent a shiver through her. She sat up, pushing the blanket aside. Rhett was already awake, tending to his horse. He glanced at her, a faint smile touching his lips.
"Morning," he said.
"Morning," Addie replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. She felt awkward and exposed, as if he could read her thoughts, her confused emotions. They packed their gear in silence, the routine familiar by now. Addie noticed that Rhett seemed more relaxed this morning, his usual guarded expression softened. As they set off, walking westward, Addie found herself studying him, trying to understand the changes she sensed in him. He seemed less withdrawn, more open. Was it her imagination, or was he actually seeking her company, her conversation? "You said you lost hope," Addie said, breaking the silence. "What happened?" He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She thought he might refuse to answer, but then he spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "It was a long time ago," he said. "I was young, idealistic. I believed in justice, in doing what was right." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I was a deputy in a small town in Texas. I was engaged to be married to a woman I loved more than life itself." Addie listened, her heart aching for him. She could hear the pain in his voice, the echoes of a past that still haunted him. "There was a gang of outlaws," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They terrorized the town, robbing and killing. I tried to stop them, but I was outnumbered, outgunned." He stopped walking, his body trembling slightly. Addie reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. He didn't pull away. They killed her," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "My Sarah. They killed her in front of me." Addie gasped, her eyes filling with tears. She couldn't imagine the pain he must have endured, the horror of witnessing such a brutal act. "I hunted them down," he continued, his voice cold and hard. "Every last one of them. I killed them all." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief, rage, and self-loathing. "But it didn't bring her back. It didn't bring me peace. It just made me empty." Addie didn't know what to say. She simply stood there, her hand still on his arm, offering him what comfort she could. "That's why I became what I am," he said, his voice weary. "A gunfighter. A man with nothing left to lose." Addie understood now. His reputation, his violence, his guarded demeanor, it was all a shield, a way to protect himself from further pain, from ever having to feel that kind of loss again. "I'm so sorry, Rhett," she said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "It was a long time ago," he repeated, as if trying to convince himself. They started walking again, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but filled with a shared understanding of pain and loss. Addie realized that she was beginning to see him not just as a gunfighter, but as a man, a human being who had suffered, who had loved, who had lost. As the day wore on, their conversation flowed more easily. They talked about their lives, their families, their dreams. Addie told him about her sister, Clara, and the urgent letter that had brought her on this journey. "She didn't say what was wrong," Addie said, her voice filled with worry.
"Just that she needed me."
"I fear something terrible has happened." Rhett listened attentively, his eyes filled with concern. "We'll get you to West Creek," he said. "We'll find out what's going on." His words, his unwavering support, gave Addie a surge of hope. She was no longer alone. She had an ally, a protector, a friend. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, they came across a small, abandoned homestead. The house was dilapidated, the roof caved in, the windows broken. But it offered a semblance of shelter, a place to rest and regroup. "We'll stay here tonight," Rhett said. Addie nodded, grateful for any respite from the harsh elements. They gathered wood and built a fire inside the crumbling walls of the house. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating an eerie, almost ghostly atmosphere. As they sat by the fire, eating a meager meal of dried beef and water, Addie felt a sense of unease. The homestead felt haunted, filled with the echoes of past lives, past tragedies. "This place, it feels sad," she said, her voice low. Rhett nodded. "Someone lived here once," he said. "Someone had hopes and dreams, just like us." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and tenderness. "We all carry our scars, Addie," he said. "Some are visible, some are hidden, but they shape us, make us who we are." Addie felt tears rising. Addie felt the lump in her throat. His words resonated deeply with her. She, too, carried scars, hidden wounds that had never fully healed. The betrayal of her former fiancé, the loss of her dreams, the constant fear of being vulnerable again, it had all left its mark. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm and strong, a reassuring presence in the darkness. "Thank you, Rhett," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "For sharing your story. For everything." He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes meeting hers. "We're in this together, Addie," he said. "We'll get through it." His words, his touch, his unwavering support filled her with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. She was still afraid, uncertain of the future, but she was no longer alone. She had Rhett Dawson by her side, a man who had shared his deepest pain, his darkest secrets, and in doing so, had forged a bond between them, a connection that transcended fear and uncertainty. As they sat together in the crumbling homestead, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Addie felt a flicker of something new, something fragile and precious, whispering of a future she hadn't dared to imagine, a future where even scarred hearts could find solace and, perhaps, even love. Chapter 7. The Price of Trust on the Frontier. The next day dawned bright and clear, the sky a vast expanse of cloudless blue. Addie woke feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Rhett's story had touched her deeply, and she was determined to help him, just as he was helping her. She felt a growing connection to him, a bond forged in shared hardship and vulnerability. They set off early, their pace brisk. They were nearing West Creek, and Addie's anxiety about her sister intensified with each passing mile. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As they walked, Rhett taught her some basic survival skills: how to track animals, how to find water in the desert, how to build a shelter. He was a patient teacher, his instructions clear and concise. Addie appreciated his willingness to share his knowledge, his expertise. "You're a good teacher," she said, smiling at him. He shrugged, a hint of embarrassment in his expression. "Just practical skills," he said. "Things you need to know out here." "Still, I'm grateful," Addie said. "I feel safer, knowing these things." He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a warmth that made her heart flutter. "I'll keep you safe, Addie," he said, his voice low and sincere.
"I promise you that."
His words, his unwavering commitment, sent a wave of emotion through her. She trusted him, she realized. Despite his past, despite his reputation, she trusted him with her life. As they approached West Creek, the landscape began to change. The harsh, barren desert gave way to rolling hills, dotted with trees and patches of grass. They saw signs of civilization, a well-worn wagon trail, a distant ranch house, a herd of cattle grazing in a field. Addie's heart quickened with anticipation. She was so close to finding Clara, to uncovering the truth behind that desperate letter. They reached the outskirts of West Creek in the late afternoon. It was a small, dusty town, typical of the frontier. A main street lined with wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a sheriff's office. Horses were tied to hitching posts and people bustled about, going about their daily lives. Addie felt a surge of unease as she scanned the faces of the townspeople. They seemed wary, their eyes filled with suspicion. She sensed a tension in the air, a hidden undercurrent of fear. "Something's not right," she said to Rhett, her voice low. He nodded, his hand resting on the handle of his Colt. "Stay close," he said. They walked down the main street, their boots crunching on the dusty ground. Addie noticed that people were staring at them, whispering behind their hands. She felt a growing sense of dread. They reached the sheriff's office, a small, wooden building with a barred window. Rhett pushed open the door and stepped inside, Addie following close behind. The office was sparsely furnished, a desk, a few chairs, a gun rack on the wall. A man sat behind the desk, his feet propped up, his hat tilted low over his eyes. He looked up as they entered, his expression one of bored indifference. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice gruff and unwelcoming. "I'm looking for my sister, Clara West," Addie said. "She lives here." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Clara West," he repeated, his voice flat. "Don't know her." Addie felt a jolt of fear. "She wrote to me, said she needed me. She lives here. I'm sure of it." The sheriff shrugged. "Maybe she moved on. People come and go in this town." Addie's frustration grew. "She wouldn't just leave without telling me. Something's wrong. Can you help me find her?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and hard. "Lady, I got enough problems without chasing after missing women. If she's gone, she's gone." Addie's temper flared. "She's my sister. I need to find her." Rhett placed a calming hand on her arm. "Sheriff," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're just asking for your help. Any information you can give us would be appreciated." The sheriff looked at Rhett, his eyes lingering on the Colt at his hip. He seemed to recognize him, or at least recognize the type of man he was. "All right," the sheriff said, his voice grudgingly. "I'll ask around. But I ain't promising nothing." He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "Come back tomorrow. Maybe I'll have something for you." He practically dismisses them, without a second look. Addie and Rhett exchanged a look of frustration and disappointment. They left the sheriff's office, feeling more uneasy than ever. "He's lying," Addie said, her voice tight with anger. "He knows something." Rhett nodded. "I agree. Something's not right in this town." They walked down the street, trying to decide what to do next. Addie felt a growing sense of desperation. She had to find Clara. As they passed the saloon, a man stumbled out, his face flushed, his eyes glazed with drink. He bumped into Addie, nearly knocking her over. "Watch it, lady," he slurred. Rhett stepped in front of Addie, his hand on his gun. "Apologize," he said, his voice cold and menacing. The drunk man looked at Rhett, his eyes widening in fear. He mumbled an apology and stumbled away. A woman standing nearby watched the scene unfold, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. "Recognition? You're Clara's sister, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low. Addie turned to her, her heart pounding.
"Yes," she said.
"Do you know her? Do you know where she is?" The woman glanced around nervously. "Not here," she whispered. "Meet me at the old church at the edge of town. After dark. I'll tell you what I know." And with that, she hurried away, disappearing into the crowd. Addie stared after her, her mind racing. The price of trust, she realized, was steep on the frontier. Every interaction, every offer of help, could be a trap, a betrayal. But she had no choice. She had to trust this woman, had to follow this lead, if she had any hope of finding her sister. The weight of the unknown, the secrets hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary town, pressed down on her as she prepared to venture into the darkness, hoping to find answers, and fearing what those answers might be. Chapter 8. A shared meal, a shared silence. The hours until nightfall stretched out, each minute an eternity. Addie and Rhett found a small, relatively clean room above the general store, the only lodging available in West Creek. The room was sparsely furnished, a narrow bed, a rickety chair, a wash basin, and a cracked mirror. But it offered a temporary refuge, a place to rest and plan. Addie paced restlessly, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was in danger, that time was running out. Rhett watched her, his expression concerned. "You need to calm down, Addie," he said. "Worrying won't help." "I can't help it," Addie replied, her voice tight. "I feel like something terrible has happened to her." He reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "We'll find her," he said. "I promise you." His words, his unwavering support, helped to ease her anxiety, if only slightly. She squeezed his hand, grateful for his presence, his strength. They decided to get something to eat. The only option was the saloon, a place Addie would normally avoid at all costs. But she was too hungry, too preoccupied with Clara, to care. The saloon was dimly lit and smoky, filled with the sounds of raucous laughter, clinking glasses, and the tinny music of a piano. The patrons, a mix of cowboys, miners, and drifters, eyed them with suspicion as they entered. They found a small, relatively secluded table in a corner. A weary-looking waitress took their order, stew and coffee for both. The food was surprisingly good, the stew thick and flavorful, the coffee strong and hot. Addie ate hungrily, realizing how little she had eaten in the past few days. Rhett ate in silence, his gaze fixed on the crowd. He seemed to be on high alert, constantly scanning the room for any sign of trouble. Addie watched him, admiring his vigilance, his quiet strength. She felt safer with him, protected. But she also sensed a sadness in him, a deep-seated loneliness that mirrored her own. "You're quiet tonight," she said, breaking the silence. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Just thinking," he replied. "About what?" Addie asked, her voice soft. He hesitated, then shrugged. "About this town," he said. "About your sister. About everything." Addie understood. The situation was tense, uncertain. They were surrounded by strangers, unsure who to trust. They finished their meal in silence, the unspoken tension between them palpable. Addie felt a growing sense of connection to Rhett, a shared understanding that transcended words. As they left the saloon, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the dusty street. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dust. "It's time," Addie said, her voice low. "The old church." Rhett nodded, his hand resting on the handle of his Colt. "Let's go." They walked to the edge of town, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. The old church was a dilapidated wooden structure, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling. It looked abandoned, forgotten. Addie felt a shiver run down her spine. The place felt ominous, filled with a sense of foreboding. They approached the church cautiously, their senses on high alert. The door creaked open as they pushed it, revealing a dark, dusty interior. A single candle flickered on the altar, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The woman from the saloon was waiting for them, her face pale and drawn. "You came," she said, her voice trembling. "Tell me about my sister," Addie said, her voice urgent. "What happened to her?" The woman hesitated, glancing around nervously. "It's dangerous," she whispered. "They'll kill me if they find out I talked to you."
Who will?
Red asked, his voice calm but firm.
Tell us.
The woman took a deep breath, her eyes filled with fear. "The sheriff," she said.
And his men.
They control everything in this town." Addie felt a jolt of anger and disbelief. "The sheriff?
But why?
What did Clara do?" "She found out something," the woman said. "Something they didn't want anyone to know. Something about the mine." The mine. Addie had heard whispers about it, rumors of strange goings-on. It was the main source of income for the town, but it was also shrouded in secrecy. "What about the mine?" Addie pressed. The woman looked at Rhett, then back at Addie. "It's not what it seems," she whispered. "They're not just mining for ore. They're hiding something. Something illegal. And Clara, she found out." Addie's heart pounded in her chest. She just knew, that her sister was in grave danger. "Where is she?" Addie demanded, her voice trembling. "Where did they take her?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting nervously towards the door. I don't know for sure," she whispered. "But I heard them talking. They said they were taking her to the mine." The shared silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of the woman's words, the implications of the sheriff's corruption, and the terrifying possibility of what awaited them at the mine. Addie felt a surge of determination, a fierce resolve to save her sister, no matter the cost. The shared meal, the shared silence, had solidified her bond with Rhett, and now, as they faced the unknown dangers that lay ahead, she knew she could count on him, just as he could count on her. Chapter 9. Shadows in the Canyon Walls. The revelation about the sheriff and the mine sent a chill down Addie's spine. The very person who should have been protecting the town was instead its oppressor. And Clara, her brave, inquisitive sister, had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that had put her life in peril. "We have to go to the mine," Addie said, her voice filled with determination. "We have to save her." Rhett nodded, his expression grim. "It's a risk," he said. "The sheriff and his men will be expecting us." "I don't care," Addie replied. "I'm not leaving without my sister." The woman from the church, whose name Addie had learned was Martha, offered to guide them. She knew a back way to the mine, a less traveled path that would help them avoid detection. They left the church, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Martha led them through the back alleys of the town, past darkened houses and deserted streets. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting long, eerie shadows that danced around them. Addie felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling of fear at the back of her neck. She knew they were walking into a trap, but she had no choice. She had to save Clara. As they left the town behind, the landscape became more rugged, the terrain more difficult to navigate. They climbed a steep, rocky path, the air growing thinner and colder. Martha stopped at the edge of a deep canyon. "The mine is down there," she whispered, pointing into the darkness. "But be careful. The canyon walls are treacherous." Addie peered into the canyon, her heart pounding. She could see nothing but darkness, hear nothing but the whisper of the wind. Rhett took the lead, his movements cautious and deliberate. He tested each foothold before putting his weight on it, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. They descended into the canyon slowly, carefully, the loose rocks slipping beneath their feet. The darkness was oppressive, the silence broken only by the occasional scuttling of a small animal. Addie felt a sense of claustrophobia, a feeling of being trapped in this narrow, winding passage. She clung to the rocks, her hands scraped and bleeding. As they neared the bottom of the canyon, they heard voices, faint at first, then growing louder. They were coming from the mine entrance, a dark, gaping hole in the canyon wall. Rhett signaled for them to stop. He peered around a bend in the path, his body tense and alert. "2 guards," he whispered. "Armed." Addie felt a surge of fear, but also a surge of determination. She wouldn't let fear stop her. She had to get to Clara. Rhett drew his Colt, his movements swift and silent. He looked at Addie, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and resolve. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll take care of them." Addie wanted to protest, to argue that she could help, but she knew he was right. He was the experienced gunfighter, the one who knew how to handle this situation. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched as he disappeared around the bend, his silhouette fading into the darkness. The silence stretched, agonizingly long. Addie held her breath, listening intently. She heard a muffled thud, then another, then silence. Rhett reappeared, his expression grim. "They're taken care of," he said, his voice low. "But there are more inside." Addie felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had made it past the guards, but the real danger lay ahead, inside the mine. Martha decided to go back to the town. Martha, her face pale with fear, decided she could go no further. "I've done all I can," she whispered. "I have to go back. Please be careful." Addie thanked her, understanding her fear. She and Rhett were on their own now, facing the unknown dangers of the mine alone. They entered the mine, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something metallic and acrid. Rhett lit a small lantern he had brought, casting a faint, flickering circle of light. The mine shaft was narrow and low, the walls rough and uneven. They walked slowly, cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They came to a fork in the tunnel. Rhett examined the ground, looking for signs of recent activity. "This way," he said, pointing to the left tunnel. "There are fresh boot prints." They continued deeper into the mine, the darkness pressing in on them. Addie felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that they were walking into the heart of evil. They heard voices ahead, muffled by the thick walls of the mine. Rhett extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. They crept closer, their senses on high alert. They reached a large cavern, where several men were working, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of lanterns. Addie scanned the faces, her heart pounding. She didn't see Clara. "Where is she?" she whispered to Rhett, her voice filled with desperation. He shook his head, his eyes narrowed. "I don't know, but she's here somewhere." They watched as the men loaded or onto a cart, their movements slow and laborious. They were talking amongst themselves, their voices low and gruff. Addie caught snippets of their conversation. "Dutch sheriff, shipment, tonight." Her blood ran cold. They were planning to move something illegal tonight. And Clara was likely caught in the middle of it. Suddenly, one of the men looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Who's there?" he shouted. Addie and Rhett froze, their bodies pressed against the cold, damp wall of the mine. The shadows in the canyon walls had hidden them so far, but now, their presence discovered, the fragile hope of a silent rescue shattered, replaced by the imminent threat of a confrontation they couldn't avoid. The darkness that had been their ally now felt like a suffocating shroud, as they prepared to face the consequences of their intrusion, their desperate search for Clara leading them deeper into the heart of danger. Chapter 10. The Ghost Town's Secret. The shout echoed through the cavern, shattering the silence. The miners, their faces illuminated by the flickering lanterns, turned towards the source of the sound, their hands reaching for their weapons. Addie and Rhett remained hidden in the shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Show yourselves." The man shouted again, his voice harsh and menacing. Rhett stepped forward, his Colt drawn and ready. "We're looking for someone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "A woman. Clara West." The miners exchanged glances, their suspicion evident. "We don't know any Clara West," one of them said, his hand hovering near his gun. "She's here," Addie said, stepping forward beside Rhett.
"I know she is."
The miners tightened their grips on their weapons. The tension in the cavern was palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. "You're trespassing," the leader of the miners said, his voice cold and hard. "Get out of here before you get hurt." "Not without my sister," Addie replied, her voice trembling but firm. Rhett stood beside her, his presence a reassuring force. He was calm, collected, his eyes scanning the faces of the miners, assessing the threat. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the back of the cavern. "Let them through." The miners parted, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. It was the sheriff, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. "Fear? Well, the sheriff said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here." The nosy sister and her gunfighter friend. Addie felt a surge of anger. "Where is she?" she demanded. "Where's Clara?" The sheriff smiled, a cruel, mocking smile.
"She's safe," he said. "For now."
"What have you done with her?" Addie pressed, her voice rising. The sheriff's smile faded.
"She knows too much," he said.
"She saw things she shouldn't have seen." "What things?" Red asked, his voice calm but menacing. The sheriff hesitated, then gestured towards a dark tunnel at the back of the cavern. "Down there," he said. "That's where we keep our secrets." Addie felt a chill run down her spine. The mine was more than just a mine. It was a hiding place, a place of secrets and lies. "We're going in there," Red said, his voice firm. The sheriff shook his head. "I wouldn't advise that," he said. "It's dangerous." "We're not afraid," Addie said, her voice filled with determination. The sheriff shrugged.
"Suit yourselves," he said.
"But don't say I didn't warn you." He signaled to his men, and they stepped aside, clearing a path to the tunnel. Addie and Red exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. They knew they were walking into a trap, but they had no choice. They had to save Clara. They entered the tunnel, the darkness swallowing them whole. Red lit a lantern, casting a faint, flickering circle of light. The air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something acrid and unsettling. They walked slowly, cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, leading them deeper and deeper into the earth. They came to a large chamber, the walls lined with wooden crates. The crates were stacked high, reaching almost to the ceiling. "What is this place?" Addie whispered, her voice filled with awe and apprehension. Red examined the crates, his brow furrowed.
"I don't know," he said.
"But it's something illegal. Something they're hiding." Suddenly, they heard a noise, a faint cry coming from behind one of the stacks of crates. Addie's heart leaped with hope. "Clara?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Addie?" a weak voice replied. "Is that you?" Addie rushed towards the sound, her heart pounding. She found Clara tied to a chair, her face bruised and swollen, her clothes torn.
"Clara!"
Addie cried, rushing to her side. "Oh, Clara, are you all right?" Clara nodded weakly.
"I'm alive," she said.
"But they were going to kill me." Addie quickly untied her, her hands trembling with relief and anger. She helped Clara to her feet, supporting her as she stumbled. "We have to get out of here," Addie said. Red stood guard, his Colt drawn and ready. He knew that the sheriff and his men wouldn't let them leave easily. As they made their way back through the tunnel, they heard voices, shouts, the sounds of a struggle. The sheriff and his men were coming after them. They reached the main cavern, where the miners were waiting for them, their guns drawn. The sheriff stood at the front, his face twisted with rage. "He is completely cornered. You're not going anywhere," he snarled. Rhett stepped forward, his Colt leveled at the sheriff. "We're leaving," he said, his voice cold and hard. "And you're not going to stop us." The tension in the cavern was thick, the air heavy with the threat of violence. Addie stood beside Rhett, holding Clara close, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was it, the final confrontation. The secret of the ghost town, the illegal operation hidden within the mine, was about to be exposed, and the price of that exposure could be their lives. The shadows danced around them, the flickering lanterns casting an eerie glow on the faces of the men who stood between them and freedom, between them and the truth that Clara had risked everything to uncover. Chapter 11. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. The standoff in the cavern felt like an eternity. The miners, their faces grim and determined, held their ground, their guns trained on Rhett and Addie. The sheriff, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and desperation, stood at the forefront, his hand hovering near his own weapon. "You're making a mistake, Dawson," the sheriff said, his voice tight with tension. "You don't know what you're getting into." "I know enough," Rhett replied, his voice calm but firm. "I know you're hiding something illegal in this mine. And I know you're holding this woman's sister against her will." "She saw too much," the sheriff said. "She had to be silenced." "She's done nothing wrong," Addie protested, her voice trembling. "Let us go." The sheriff shook his head.
"I can't do that," he said. "You know too much now."
He signaled to his men, and they tightened their grips on their weapons. The situation was about to explode, the tension reaching a breaking point. Suddenly, a voice rang out from behind them. "Drop your weapons." Everyone turned towards the sound, their eyes widening in surprise. A figure emerged from the shadows, a rifle in his hands. It was a man Addie had seen before in the saloon, the one who had stumbled out drunk and bumped into her. But he was no longer drunk. He was sober, his eyes clear and focused, his demeanor that of a man with a purpose. "What's the meaning of this, Jed?" the sheriff demanded, his voice filled with disbelief. "I said, drop your weapons," Jed repeated, his voice firm and unwavering. "All of you." The miners hesitated, looking at the sheriff for guidance. The sheriff, his face pale and drawn, slowly lowered his gun. "You're a fool, Jed," the sheriff said, his voice filled with bitterness. "You're betraying us." "I'm doing what's right," Jed replied. "Something you should have done a long time ago."
He turned to Rhett and Addie. "Get out of here," he said.
"Take the woman and go." Addie didn't hesitate. She helped Clara to her feet, and together, they followed Rhett out of the mine, leaving behind the stunned miners and the furious sheriff. As they emerged from the mine, blinking in the sudden brightness of the night, Addie turned to Jed.
"Why?"
she asked. "Why are you helping us?" Jed looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. "I used to be a good man," he said, "before I got caught up in all this. Before I let the sheriff corrupt me." He paused, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Clara, she reminded me of my daughter," he said. "The one I lost years ago. I couldn't let them hurt her." Addie felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was a flawed man, a man who had made mistakes, but he was also capable of redemption, of doing the right thing. "Thank you," Addie said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You saved our lives." Jed nodded, his expression grim.
"Go now," he said,
before they changed their minds. Addie, Rhett, and Clara hurried away from the mine, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. They didn't stop until they reached the outskirts of West Creek. Clara, weak and exhausted, collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling. Addie knelt beside her, holding her close. "It's all right, Clara," she said. "You're safe now." Clara looked at her, her eyes filled with tears. "They were going to kill me, Addie," she said. "They were going to kill me." "I know," Addie said, her voice soothing. "But you're safe now. We're together." Rhett's past is connected to the town. Rhett stood nearby, watching them, his expression unreadable. He seemed distant, lost in his own thoughts. Addie noticed his silence, his withdrawn demeanor. "Rhett?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "Are you all right?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain she hadn't seen before. "This town," he said, his voice low and strained. It's where it all happened." Addie was confused. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "My Sarah," he said. "The woman I was engaged to. She was from here. This is where she died." Addie gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. She understood now. His connection to this town, his pain, his reluctance to talk about his past, it all made sense. "Oh, Rhett," she said, her voice filled with compassion.
"I'm so sorry."
He nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I thought I had buried it," he said. "I thought I had moved on. But being here, it brings it all back." Addie reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm and strong, a reassuring presence.
"You're not alone, Rhett," she said.
"I'm here. We're here." He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes meeting hers. He saw not pity, but understanding, a shared pain that transcended words. The betrayal they had witnessed in the mine, the corruption of a sheriff, Jed's act of redemption, it had all brought them closer, forging a bond that was stronger than ever. As they stood together, on the edge of the town that held both Rhett's darkest memories and the promise of a new beginning, Addie knew that their journey was far from over. The sting of betrayal lingered, but so did the hope of healing, of finding justice, of reclaiming what had been lost. Chapter 12. Running from the past, racing towards fate. The escape from West Creek was fraught with tension. They knew the sheriff wouldn't let them go easily, that he would likely send his men after them. They had to get as far away from the town as possible, as quickly as possible. Rhett, his senses on high alert, led the way. He chose a circuitous route, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the rough, uneven terrain. Clara, still weak and shaken, struggled to keep up, but Addie supported her, encouraging her, urging her on. They traveled throughout the night, stopping only for brief rests. The moon, now free of the clouds, provided a faint, silvery light, guiding their way. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and dust. Addie felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had escaped, they had survived, but they were not yet safe. She knew the sheriff's reach extended far beyond West Creek, that he had allies, connections. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky with streaks of pale pink and orange, they reached a small, secluded canyon. Rhett decided they would rest there for a few hours, hidden from view. They found a sheltered spot beneath a rocky overhang. Rhett built a small fire, using dry twigs and branches he gathered from the canyon floor. The warmth was welcome, chasing away the chill of the night. Clara, exhausted and emotionally drained, fell asleep almost immediately, curled up in Addie's blanket. Addie watched over her, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and worry. Rhett sat nearby, his gaze fixed on the entrance to the canyon. He was silent, withdrawn, his thoughts seemingly far away. Addie knew he was struggling with the memories of his past, with the pain of returning to the place where his life had been shattered. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer him comfort, but she didn't know how. "Are you all right?" she asked, finally, her voice soft. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness she had come to recognize. "I'm trying to be," he replied. "It's hard, I know," Addie said. "Being back here." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. It's like it all happened yesterday," he said. "The pain, the loss, it's still so raw." Addie reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm and strong, a reassuring presence.
"You don't have to go through this alone, Rhett," she said.
"I'm here. We're here." He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes meeting hers. He saw not pity, but understanding, a shared pain that transcended words. "Thank you, Addie," he said, his voice low and husky.
"For everything."
They sat in silence for a while longer, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the gentle breathing of Clara. Addie felt a growing connection to Rhett, a bond forged in shared hardship, shared vulnerability, and now, shared memories. Rhett reveals his feelings. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm, golden glow on the canyon walls, Rhett turned to Addie, his eyes filled with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Addie," he said, his voice hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you." Addie felt her heart quicken. She sensed that he was about to reveal something important, something that had been weighing on his mind.
"What is it?"
she asked, her voice soft. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on hers. I've been running from my past for so long," he said. "Trying to forget, trying to move on. But being here, with you, it's made me realize that I can't run anymore." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "And it's made me realize something else," he continued. "Something I haven't allowed myself to feel in a long time." Addie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming, and she felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. "I'm falling in love with you, Addie," he said, his voice low and husky. "I know it's crazy, I know it's dangerous, but I can't deny it any longer." Addie's eyes filled with tears. She had suspected, she had hoped, but to hear him say the words, to see the raw emotion in his eyes, it overwhelmed her. "Oh, Rhett," she said, her voice trembling. I feel the same way." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently caressing her cheeks. His eyes were filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I know I'm not the man you deserve," he said. "I'm damaged, I'm flawed, I have a past that haunts me. But I swear to you, Addie, I'll do everything in my power to protect you, to make you happy." Addie leaned into his touch, her tears flowing freely.
"You don't have to be perfect, Rhett," she said. "Just be you."
He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that lit up his face. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken vows. The kiss was a revelation, a release of pent-up emotions, a promise of a future they would face together. Addie felt a surge of hope, of joy, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. She had found love in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected man. Running from the past was no longer an option. They were racing towards their fate, a fate intertwined with danger, uncertainty, but also with a love that had blossomed amidst the harsh realities of the frontier, a love that had the power to heal, to transform, to make them whole again. Chapter 13. The Sheriff's Suspicion, the Outlaw's Code. The respite in the canyon was short-lived. They knew they couldn't stay hidden forever, that the sheriff would be searching for them. They had to keep moving, to find a safe haven, a place where they could plan their next move. Clara, though still weak, was determined to be strong. She had endured a terrifying ordeal, but her spirit remained unbroken. She was grateful to Addie and Rhett for rescuing her, and she was determined to help them expose the sheriff's corruption. "We need to get to Judge Thompson," Clara said, her voice firm. "He's the only one we can trust." Judge Thompson was a circuit judge, a man known for his honesty and integrity. He was scheduled to arrive in a neighboring town, Silver Ridge, in a few days. "It's a long ride," Rhett said. "And the sheriff will be watching the roads." "We'll have to take the back trails," Clara said. "I know this country. I can guide us." Addie admired her sister's courage, her resilience. She had always been the stronger one, the more adventurous one. They set off again, following Clara's lead. She navigated the rugged terrain with skill and confidence, choosing paths that were less traveled, less likely to be patrolled by the sheriff's men. As they rode, they discussed their plan. They needed to gather evidence, proof of the sheriff's illegal activities, to present to Judge Thompson. "The crates in the mine," Addie said. "They must contain something incriminating. We need to find out what's in them," Rhett said. "And where they're being shipped." Clara had overheard the miners talking about a shipment, a delivery that was scheduled to take place soon. They needed to intercept that shipment, to expose the sheriff's operation. The journey to Silver Ridge was arduous and dangerous. They faced numerous challenges: rough terrain, scarce water, the constant threat of discovery. But they pressed on, driven by their determination to bring the sheriff to justice and to protect each other. They encounter a group of outlaws. One evening, as they were camped near a small stream, they encountered a group of outlaws. The outlaws, a rough-looking bunch, were initially hostile, suspicious of the strangers who had stumbled upon their camp.
"Who are you?"
The leader of the outlaws demanded, his hand hovering near his gun. "And what are you doing here?" Rhett stepped forward, his demeanor calm but firm. "We're just passing through," he said. "We mean you no harm." The outlaws exchanged glances, their suspicion evident. They were wary of strangers, especially those who traveled with a woman. "We're looking for Judge Thompson," Addie said, stepping forward beside Rhett. "We need his help." The leader of the outlaws raised an eyebrow. "Judge Thompson?" he repeated. "What for?" "We have information about some illegal activities," Clara said. "Something that needs to be brought to the judge's attention." The outlaws looked at each other, their expressions unreadable. They were outlaws, men who lived outside the law, but they also had their own code, their own sense of justice. "What kind of illegal activities?" the leader asked, his voice curious. Rhett and Addie exchanged a look. They were hesitant to reveal too much, unsure if they could trust these men. It involves the sheriff of West Creek, Rhett said, choosing his words carefully. He's corrupt. He's using the town's mind for his own personal gain. The outlaws listened intently, their eyes narrowed. They knew the sheriff of West Creek, and they had heard rumors of his corruption. We've seen things, Clara added. Things that prove his guilt. The leader of the outlaws considered their words, his gaze fixed on Rhett. He seemed to recognize him, or at least recognize the type of man he was. A gunfighter, a man of action, a man who lived by his own code. The outlaws offer their help. We'll help you, the leader of the outlaws said, finally. We don't like corrupt sheriffs. And we believe in justice, even if it's our own kind. Addie and Rhett were surprised by their offer. They hadn't expected help from outlaws, but they were grateful for it. Thank you, Addie said, her voice filled with relief. We appreciate it. The outlaws agreed to escort them to Silver Ridge, to protect them from the sheriff's men. They also offered to help them gather evidence, to expose the sheriff's operation. The alliance with the outlaws was unexpected, but it gave them a new sense of hope. They were no longer alone. They had allies, men who shared their desire for justice, even if their methods were unconventional. The sheriff's suspicion had driven them into the arms of unlikely companions, and the outlaws' code, surprisingly, aligned with their own pursuit of truth and fairness. As they rode together towards Silver Ridge, Addie felt a growing sense of anticipation, a feeling that they were closing in on their goal, that justice would prevail, even in the wild, lawless frontier. Chapter 14. A Dance of Danger and Desire. The journey to Silver Ridge with the outlaws was a strange and unsettling experience. Addie found herself constantly on edge, wary of her new companions. They were rough men, hardened by a life outside the law, their conversations filled with tales of robberies, shootouts, and narrow escapes. Yet, they treated Addie and Clara with respect, even a hint of protectiveness. They shared their food, their water, their blankets, and they kept a watchful eye out for any sign of danger. Rhett, surprisingly, seemed to fit in with the outlaws. He spoke their language, understood their code. Addie realized that he had more in common with them than she had initially thought. His past, his life as a gunfighter, had given him a unique perspective, a kinship with those who lived on the fringes of society. As they rode, Addie found herself drawn to Rhett, her feelings for him growing stronger with each passing day. She admired his courage, his strength, his quiet intensity. She also saw his vulnerability, his pain, the scars of his past that he tried so hard to hide. They shared quiet moments together, stolen glances, brief touches, whispered words. The danger that surrounded them seemed to heighten their awareness of each other, to intensify their emotions. A sandstorm hits. One afternoon, as they were crossing a vast, open plain, a sandstorm hit. The wind howled, whipping up the sand and dust, creating a blinding, swirling vortex. Visibility was reduced to near zero, and the air was thick with grit, making it difficult to breathe. The outlaws, experienced in dealing with the harsh conditions of the frontier, quickly found a sheltered spot behind a rocky outcrop. They huddled together, shielding their faces from the stinging sand. Addie, caught in the middle of the storm, felt a surge of panic. She couldn't see, she couldn't breathe, she felt like she was being suffocated. Rhett, sensing her fear, reached out and grabbed her hand, pulling her close. He wrapped his arm around her, shielding her from the wind and sand. "It's all right, Addie," he shouted above the roar of the storm. "I've got you. It'll pass." His words, his touch, his presence, calmed her fear. She clung to him, her body pressed against his, finding comfort in his strength, his warmth. The storm raged for what seemed like an eternity, then gradually subsided. The wind died down, the sand settled, and the sky cleared, revealing a breathtaking sunset. Addie and Rhett stood together, watching the spectacle of colors paint the sky. They were covered in dust, their clothes gritty, their faces streaked with sand, but they were unharmed. Rhett looked at Addie, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. Addie nodded, her eyes meeting his.
I am now, she said.
He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that lit up his face. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was filled with a longing that mirrored her own. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. They were lost in each other, oblivious to the world around them. The outlaws, sensing the intimacy of the moment, discreetly looked away, giving them privacy. Addie and Rhett finally broke apart, their breath coming in short, shallow gasps. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of desire and uncertainty. They finally arrive at Silver Ridge. They knew their situation was precarious, their future uncertain. But in that moment, surrounded by the vastness of the desert, under the watchful eyes of the outlaws, they had found a connection, a spark of love that transcended the danger, the uncertainty. As darkness fell, they continued their journey to Silver Ridge. The town was just a few hours away, and Addie felt a growing sense of anticipation, a mixture of hope and apprehension. They arrived in Silver Ridge under the cover of darkness. The town was quiet, the streets deserted. The outlaws, their task completed, bid them farewell, disappearing into the night. Addie, Rhett, and Clara found a small, discreet hotel on the outskirts of town. They were exhausted, emotionally drained, but they were also relieved to have reached their destination. They knew they had to be careful. The sheriff likely had informants in Silver Ridge, and they couldn't afford to be seen. They needed to find Judge Thompson, to present their evidence, to expose the sheriff's corruption. The dance of danger and desire had brought them to this point, a town where they hoped to find justice, where their love would be tested, and where their fate would be decided. The quiet streets of Silver Ridge held both promise and peril, and as they settled in for the night, they knew that the coming days would be crucial, a turning point in their journey, a test to their courage and their commitment to each other. Chapter 15. The Truth Behind the Eyes. The next morning, Addie, Rhett, and Clara set about finding Judge Thompson. They knew they had to be discreet, that the sheriff's influence might extend even to Silver Ridge. They couldn't simply walk into the courthouse and ask for him. Clara, using her knowledge of the area, suggested they start by inquiring at the local saloon. It was a risky move, but saloons were often hubs of information, places where people gathered and gossip flowed freely. They entered the saloon cautiously, their senses on high alert. The room was dimly lit and smoky, filled with the usual mix of cowboys, miners, and drifters. They found a small table in a corner, away from the main crowd. Rhett ordered drinks, while Addie and Clara scanned the faces of the patrons, looking for anyone who might seem trustworthy, anyone who might have information about Judge Thompson. A young woman, a waitress, approached their table. She was pretty, with bright eyes and a friendly smile. Addie decided to take a chance. "Excuse me," Addie said, her voice low. "We're looking for Judge Thompson. Do you know where we might find him?" The waitress hesitated, her eyes flickering nervously around the room. "He's here," she whispered. "But he's being watched." Addie felt a jolt of alarm.
Watched?
"By whom?" "The sheriff's men," the waitress replied. "They're everywhere." Rhett leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Can you get a message to him? Tell him we have information about the sheriff of West Creek. Important information." The waitress considered their request, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. "Determination?" "I can try," she said finally. "But it's risky." "We appreciate it," Addie said. "It's a matter of life and death." The waitress nodded and slipped away, disappearing into the crowd. Addie, Rhett, and Clara waited anxiously, their hopes resting on this young woman, this stranger who had risked her own safety to help them. After what seemed like an eternity, the waitress returned, her expression unreadable. "He'll see you," she whispered. "But not here. He's staying at the Grand Hotel, room 204. Go after dark.
And be careful."
Addie thanked her, pressing a few coins into her hand. The waitress smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that gave Addie a surge of hope. They left the saloon, their hearts pounding with anticipation and apprehension. They had a chance to finally expose the sheriff, to bring him to justice. But they also knew they were walking into a dangerous situation, that the sheriff wouldn't hesitate to silence them. They meet with the judge. As darkness fell, they made their way to the Grand Hotel, a large, imposing building on the main street. They slipped in through a side entrance, avoiding the lobby, and found their way to room 204. Rhett knocked softly on the door. A voice, deep and authoritative, answered.
Who is it?
We have information for Judge Thompson, Rhett replied, about the sheriff of West Creek. The door opened, revealing a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. It was Judge Thompson. He ushered them inside, his expression cautious. What is this about? He asked, his voice low. Addie, Rhett, and Clara told him their story, recounting their experiences in West Creek, the sheriff's corruption, the illegal activities in the mine, Clara's abduction, and their escape. Judge Thompson listened intently, his eyes narrowing as he heard the details. He asked probing questions, his mind sharp and analytical. Do you have any proof? He asked finally. Evidence to support your claims? We have Clara's testimony, Addie said. And we know about a shipment, a delivery that's supposed to take place soon. If we can intercept that shipment, we can prove what's going on. Judge Thompson considered their words, his gaze fixed on Rhett. He seemed to be assessing him, trying to determine if he was trustworthy. You're Rhett Dawson, aren't you? The judge asked, his voice suddenly sharp. Rhett nodded, his expression unreadable. I am. Judge Thompson's eyes held a flicker of recognition, perhaps even a hint of respect. He had heard of Rhett Dawson, the legendary gunfighter, the man with a reputation for both violence and justice. The judge agrees to help. I believe you, Judge Thompson said, finally. And I'll help you. But we need to be careful. The sheriff has allies, even here in Silver Ridge. He outlined a plan. He would issue a warrant for the sheriff's arrest, and he would authorize Rhett and a few trusted deputies to intercept the shipment, to gather the evidence they needed. The plan was risky, dangerous, but it was their only hope. Addie, Rhett, and Clara agreed to it, their determination unwavering. Rhett stares deeply into Addie's eyes. As they were about to leave, Rhett turned to Addie, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart flutter. He took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her. Addie, he said, his voice low and husky. I need you to know no matter what happens. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He saw not fear, but courage, a strength that matched his own. I love you, he finished, his voice filled with emotion. And I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. Addie's eyes filled with tears. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken vows. I love you too, Rhett, she said, her voice trembling. They knew their journey was far from over, that danger still lurked around every corner. But they also knew they had each other, that their love was a source of strength, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The truth behind Rhett's eyes, the honesty and vulnerability he had shown, had solidified their bond, and as they prepared to face the challenges ahead, they knew they would face them together, their love a shield against the harsh realities of the frontier, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. Chapter 16. A Promise Made in the Dead of Night. With Judge Thompson's warrant and a hastily assembled posse of trusted deputies, Rhett set out to intercept the shipment from the West Creek mine. Addie wanted to go with him, but Rhett insisted she stay behind, in the relative safety of Silver Ridge. He couldn't bear the thought of her being in danger again. I'll be back, Addie, he promised, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. I swear it. He kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that spoke volumes of his love, his commitment, his fear. Then, he mounted his horse and rode off into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Addie watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of pride, fear, and love. She knew he was doing what he had to do, that he was fighting for justice, for their future. But she couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the premonition of danger. She and Clara spent the night in a small, hidden room at the back of the hotel, provided by Judge Thompson. They waited anxiously, praying for Rhett's safe return, for the success of their mission. The hours dragged by, each minute an eternity. Addie paced restlessly, her mind racing, imagining all the things that could go wrong. Clara, though equally worried, tried to remain calm, to reassure her sister. As dawn approached, Addie heard the sound of horses, the muffled voices of men. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding. It was Rhett, returning with the deputies and the captured wagons from the mine. Addie ran outside, her relief overwhelming. She saw Rhett, his face smudged with dirt and sweat, his clothes torn, but he was alive. He was unharmed. He dismounted and rushed towards her, his eyes searching hers. He saw not fear, but relief, a love that mirrored his own. "Addie," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's done. We got the evidence." He took her in his arms, holding her close, his embrace a haven from the fear, the uncertainty. She clung to him, her body trembling with relief. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "I am now," he said. "We all are." The deputies had secured the wagons, and Judge Thompson, who had arrived with them, ordered the crates to be opened. The contents were revealed, not ore, but guns, rifles, ammunition, illegal weapons being smuggled to a notorious outlaw gang operating in the territory. The sheriff's corruption was exposed, his illegal activities brought to light. He was arrested, along with his men, and taken into custody to await trial. They returned to West Creek. With the sheriff and his gang behind bars, Addie, Rhett, and Clara returned to West Creek. The town was transformed. The atmosphere of fear and oppression had lifted, replaced by a sense of relief, of hope. The townspeople, freed from the sheriff's tyranny, welcomed them as heroes. Jed, the man who had betrayed the sheriff and helped them escape the mine, was hailed as a local hero. He had turned his life around, choosing to do what was right, even at great personal risk. Addie and Clara set about rebuilding their lives, reclaiming their home, their community. Clara, though still haunted by her ordeal, found strength in her sister's love and support. Rhett, his mission accomplished, his past confronted, faced a choice. He could move on, continue his life as a gunfighter, a wanderer. Or he could stay, build a new life with Addie, a life filled with love, with hope, with a future. Rhett makes a promise. One evening, as the sun set, casting a warm, golden glow over the town, Rhett found Addie sitting on the porch of her house, gazing out at the horizon. He sat down beside her, his presence a comfort, a reassurance. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice soft. Addie smiled, her eyes filled with a peace she hadn't felt in years. "About the future," she said. "About us." Rhett took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His hand was warm and strong, a symbol of his love, his protection. "I've been doing a lot of thinking too, Addie," he said. "About my life, about my choices. I've been running for so long, from my past, from my pain. But I don't want to run anymore." He looked at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart flutter. "I want to stay, Addie," he said. "With you. If you'll have me." Addie's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love. "Oh, Rhett," she said, her voice trembling. "Of course I'll have you. I love you." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their promise, their commitment to each other. It was a promise made in the dead of night, under the vast, starlit sky of the frontier, a promise to build a life together, to face the future with courage, with hope, with a love that had blossomed amidst danger and uncertainty, a love that had the power to heal, to transform, to make them whole again. The promise was a testament to their journey, a symbol of the new beginning they had earned, a future where the echoes of gunfire and regret would fade, replaced by the whispers of love and the promise of a life lived together, under the endless sky of the West. Chapter 17. Crossroads of the Heart. The decision to stay in West Creek was not an easy one for Rhett. He had spent years wandering, drifting from town to town, never putting down roots, never allowing himself to get close to anyone. He had built walls around his heart, protecting himself from the pain of loss, the vulnerability of love. But Addie had changed everything. She had shown him kindness, compassion, understanding. She had seen past his reputation, his rough exterior, to the wounded soul beneath. She had offered him a chance at redemption, at a new life, a life filled with love and hope. He knew he was taking a risk. Staying in West Creek meant facing his past, confronting the memories of Sarah, the woman he had loved and lost. It meant exposing himself to the possibility of further pain, of further loss. But he was also drawn to the town, to the sense of community, of belonging, that he had found there. He had helped to liberate West Creek from the sheriff's tyranny, and he felt a responsibility to help rebuild it, to make it a better place. He found a small, abandoned ranch on the outskirts of town, a place with potential, a place where he could start over. It needed work, a lot of work, but he was willing to put in the effort. He wanted to build something, to create something lasting, something that would represent his commitment to Addie, to their future. Addie, thrilled by Rhett's decision to stay, threw herself into helping him restore the ranch. She cleaned, she painted, she planted a garden, she filled the house with warmth and laughter. She was determined to make it a home, a place where they could build a life together, a place where they could heal, where they could love. They face opposition. Not everyone in West Creek welcomed Rhett's presence. Some people remembered his reputation, his past as a gunfighter. They were wary of him, suspicious of his motives. They whispered behind his back, spread rumors, made their disapproval known. Rhett tried to ignore the negativity, to focus on his work, on his relationship with Addie. But the opposition stung, reminding him of the darkness he had tried so hard to escape. Addie, sensing his struggle, stood by him, defending him, challenging the naysayers. She believed in him, in his goodness, in his capacity for change. Her unwavering support gave him strength, helped him to persevere. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of their newly renovated ranch house, watching the sunset, Rhett turned to Addie, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Addie," he said, his voice low and husky, "for believing in me, for standing by me." Addie smiled, her eyes shining with love.
"I'll always stand by you, Rhett," she said.
"Always." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken vows. It was a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of commitment, of a love that had weathered storms, that had overcome obstacles, that had endured. A figure from Rhett's past appears. As they were preparing for bed, they heard a knock on the door. Rhett, his senses on high alert, reached for his gun. He opened the door cautiously, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. It was a woman, tall and slender, with long, dark hair and piercing blue eyes. She looked familiar, hauntingly familiar. "Rhett?" she said, her voice hesitant. "Is that really you?" Rhett stared at her, his eyes widening in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was impossible, a ghost from his past. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Is that you?" The woman nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "It's me, Rhett," she said.
"I'm alive."
Addie, standing behind Rhett, gasped. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Sarah, the woman Rhett had loved and lost, the woman who had haunted his past, was standing before them, alive and well. The crossroads of a heart had presented them with an unimaginable twist, a challenge that would test their love, their commitment, their very understanding of the past and the future. The figure from Rhett's past had stepped out of the shadows, bringing with her a storm of emotions, a tidal wave of questions, and a threat to the fragile happiness they had fought so hard to build. Chapter 18. The Storm Breaks. The revelation that Sarah was alive sent shockwaves through Addie and Rhett. It was as if the past had risen from the grave, a ghost returned to haunt their present, to threaten their future. Rhett stood there, frozen, his eyes fixed on Sarah, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. He had mourned her, he had buried her, he had spent years trying to come to terms with her loss. And now, here she was standing before him, alive and well. How is this possible? he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah stepped inside, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness, guilt, and something else. Hope.
It's a long story, Rhett, she said.
A complicated story. Addie, though stunned by the turn of events, remained composed. She offered Sarah a chair, a cup of coffee, a semblance of hospitality in the midst of the emotional turmoil. They sat down at the kitchen table, the three of them, the air thick with tension, with unspoken questions, with a sense of impending doom. Sarah began to tell her story, a story of betrayal, of deception, of a desperate attempt to escape a life she no longer wanted. She explained that she had been forced into an engagement with Rhett by her father, a wealthy and powerful rancher who had controlled her life. She hadn't loved Rhett, not in the way he had loved her. She had been in love with another man, a young artist who had been deemed unsuitable by her father. On the day of the supposed attack by the outlaws, Sarah had seen an opportunity to escape. She had staged her own death with the help of a trusted friend and had fled West Creek, leaving behind everything she knew. "I'm so sorry, Rhett," she said, her voice filled with remorse. "I know I hurt you. I know I broke your heart. But I had to do it. I had to be free." Rhett listened in silence, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He felt a mixture of anger, betrayal, relief, and confusion. He had spent years grieving for her, blaming himself for her death. And now, he learned that it had all been a lie, a carefully orchestrated deception. Addie watched him, her heart aching for him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the struggle he was going through. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer him comfort, but she didn't know how. She felt like an outsider, an intruder in a drama that had begun long before she had entered his life. "Sarah wants Rhett back." As Sarah finished her story, she turned to Rhett, her eyes pleading. "I know I have no right to ask this," she said. "But I still love you, Rhett. I've always loved you. Can you ever forgive me? Can we start over?" Addie felt a cold hand grip her heart. She had known, deep down, that this moment might come, that Rhett's past might resurface, that his love for Sarah might still linger. Rhett looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. He had loved her once, with all his heart. But that love had been shattered, twisted by betrayal and deception. He looked at Addie, his gaze searching hers. He saw not accusation, not jealousy, but understanding, a quiet strength that had always drawn him to her. Rhett is conflicted. He was torn, conflicted. He had a past with Sarah, a history that had shaped him, that had defined him. But he also had a present with Addie, a love that had healed him, that had given him hope, that had offered him a future. "I don't know, Sarah," he said, his voice hesitant. "I need time. I need to think." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I understand," she said. "I'll give you time. But please, Rhett, don't shut me out completely." She stood up to leave, her movements graceful, her demeanor that of a woman who had known both privilege and hardship. "I'm staying at the hotel in town," she said. If you want to talk, you know where to find me." She left, closing the door softly behind her. Rhett and Addie were alone again, left to grapple with the storm that had broken over them, the wreckage of the past threatening to destroy the fragile foundation of their present. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions, with a sense of uncertainty, with a fear that their love might not be strong enough to withstand the force of Sarah's return. Chapter 19. Reclaiming what was lost. The days following Sarah's reappearance were a torment for both Addie and Rhett. The past had intruded upon their present, casting a long shadow over their relationship, threatening to unravel the fragile bond they had forged. Rhett was withdrawn, distant, his thoughts consumed by the revelation of Sarah's deception, by the resurgence of emotions he had thought long buried. He spent hours alone, riding his horse through the vast, open country, trying to make sense of his feelings, trying to find a path forward. Addie, though heartbroken by his distance, tried to be understanding, to give him the space he needed. She knew he was struggling, that he was torn between his past and his present, between the love he had once felt for Sarah and the love he now felt for her. She busied herself with work around the ranch, tending to the animals, caring for the garden, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in the midst of the emotional turmoil. But her heart ached, her mind filled with doubts, with fears. One evening, as the sun set, casting a fiery glow over the landscape, Addie found Rhett sitting on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She sat down beside him, her presence a silent offering of support. "How are you doing?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and confusion. "I don't know, Addie," he said. "I honestly don't know. Have you seen Sarah?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded. "I have," he replied. "We talked." Addie's heart clenched. She didn't want to know what they had talked about, what feelings they had shared. But she also knew she couldn't avoid the truth, that she had to face it head on. "And?" she prompted, her voice barely a whisper. Rhett took a deep breath, his gaze searching hers. "She wants me back, Addie," he said. "She says she still loves me." Addie felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had known, deep down, that this might happen, that Sarah's return might rekindle their old love. "Well, what did you tell her?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. Rhett reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His hand was warm and strong, a familiar comfort in the midst of the storm. "I told her I needed time," he said. "I told her I was in love with you." Rhett chooses Addie. He looked at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart flutter. "Addie," he said, his voice low and husky. "I know this is hard. I know Sarah's return has complicated everything. But I want you to know my heart belongs to you. You're the one I love. You're the one I want to spend my life with." Addie's eyes filled with tears, tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming love. She had been so afraid, so uncertain, but his words, his unwavering commitment, had banished her doubts, had reaffirmed her faith in their love. "Oh, Rhett," she said, her voice trembling. "I love you too. So much." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken vows. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of a love that had endured the ultimate test, a love that had emerged stronger, more resilient. They spent the next few days talking, sharing their feelings, their fears, their hopes. Rhett told Addie about his past with Sarah, about the love they had shared, about the pain of her betrayal. He also told her about his present with her, about the love they had built together, about the future he envisioned with her. Addie listened patiently, offering him her understanding, her support, her unwavering love. She knew that healing would take time, that the scars of the past would never fully disappear. But she also knew that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, to conquer any challenge. They confront Sarah together. Together, they decided to confront Sarah, to tell her their decision, to put an end to the uncertainty, to the lingering hope that she might still have a chance with Rhett. They found her at the hotel in town, sitting alone in the lobby, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as they approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Rhett spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "Sarah," he said, "we need to talk." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on him. She knew, instinctively, what he was about to say. Rhett told her about his love for Addie, about his commitment to their future together. He thanked her for her honesty, for explaining her past actions, but he also made it clear that his heart belonged to another. Sarah listened in silence, her eyes filling with tears. She had known, deep down, that this was the likely outcome, but hearing the words, seeing the truth in Rhett's eyes, it still hurt. "I understand, Rhett," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to try. I had to know." She looked at Addie, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and respect. "You're a lucky woman, Addie," she said. "He's a good man." Addie nodded, her heart aching for Sarah, for the pain she was enduring. "I know," she said, "and I'll take good care of him." Sarah smiled, a faint, bittersweet smile. "I know you will," she said. She stood up to leave, her movements graceful, her demeanor that of a woman who had accepted her fate, who had found a measure of peace. "Goodbye, Rhett," she said, her voice soft.
Goodbye, Addie.
She walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Rhett and Addie to reclaim what had been lost, to rebuild their lives, to embrace the future that awaited them. The confrontation with Sarah had been painful, but it had also been necessary, a final step in the process of healing, of moving on. As they left the hotel, hand in hand, they knew that their love had been tested, and it had prevailed. They had faced the storm, and they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable, their future secure. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. With Sarah gone, a sense of peace settled over Addie and Rhett. They had weathered the storm, they had confronted the past, and they had emerged stronger, their love solidified. They returned to their ranch, to the life they were building together, their hearts filled with hope, with anticipation for the future. But the echoes of the past, the lingering threat of those who had supported the sheriff, still lingered. They knew that while the sheriff was behind bars, his allies, his network of corruption, might still pose a danger. One evening, as they were enjoying a quiet dinner on their porch, they saw riders approaching in the distance. Rhett, his senses on high alert, recognized them immediately. They were former members of the sheriff's gang, men who had escaped justice, men who were likely seeking revenge. "Addie, get inside," Rhett said, his voice urgent. He grabbed his rifle, his movements swift and decisive. Addie hesitated, her fear battling with her desire to stand by his side. "But Rhett, go," he insisted, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I'll handle this." Addie, knowing he was right, reluctantly retreated into the house, her heart pounding with fear. She watched from the window, her hands clasped tightly together, praying for his safety. Rhett stepped off the porch, his rifle leveled at the approaching riders. There were 4 of them, their faces grim, their hands hovering near their weapons. "We're here for the woman," the leader of the gang said, his voice harsh and menacing. "And for you, Dawson." "You're not getting near her," Rhett replied, his voice cold and hard. "We'll see about that," the leader sneered. He signaled to his men, and they spurred their horses forward, their guns drawn. The final confrontation had begun. The shootout. The air erupted with the sound of gunfire. Rhett, a skilled marksman, fired with precision and speed, his shots finding their targets. The outlaws returned fire, bullets whizzing past him, kicking up dust around his feet. Addie watched in horror, her heart in her throat. She wanted to run outside, to help him, but she knew she would only be a hindrance, a liability. Rhett moved with the agility of a seasoned gunfighter, dodging bullets, seeking cover, returning fire. He was outnumbered, but he was also determined, fighting for his life, for Addie's life, for their future. One by one, the outlaws fell, their bodies collapsing onto the dusty ground. Rhett, though wounded in the arm, continued to fight, his resolve unwavering. The leader of the gang, the last one standing, faced Rhett, his eyes filled with hatred. He raised his gun, aiming at Rhett's heart. Addie, unable to bear the tension any longer, grabbed a rifle from the wall and ran outside, her heart pounding with fear and determination. She saw the outlaw aiming at Rhett, and without hesitation, she raised her rifle and fired. Her shot was true, hitting the outlaw in the chest, sending him sprawling backwards. Rhett turned, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Addie standing there, the rifle in her hands, her face pale but determined. "Addie!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "I told you to stay inside." "I couldn't let him kill you," she replied, her voice trembling. He rushed to her side, his eyes searching hers. He saw not fear, but courage, a fierce love that mirrored his own. "You saved my life," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. She nodded, her body trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline, the shock of what she had done. The end of the conflict. The shootout was over. The outlaws were defeated, their threat extinguished. The final confrontation, a battle of hearts and horizons, had ended in victory, but not without cost. Rhett, his arm bleeding, leaned against Addie for support. They stood together, surrounded by the stillness of the evening, the silence broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. The townspeople of West Creek, alerted by the gunfire, arrived at the scene, their faces filled with concern. They helped Rhett and Addie, tending to their wounds, offering their support. Jed, the former outlaw who had become a respected member of the community, stepped forward, his eyes filled with admiration.
"You both fought bravely," he said.
"You defended your home, your lives. You're true heroes." Addie and Rhett looked at each other, their eyes filled with a love that had been tested, that had endured, that had emerged stronger than ever. They had faced their final challenge, they had overcome the last remnants of the past, and they had emerged victorious. Their hearts, once scarred by loss and betrayal, were now filled with hope, with a promise of a future filled with love, with peace, with a life lived together, under the vast, open sky of the West. The final confrontation had solidified their bond, proving that their love was a force to be reckoned with, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in the wild, untamed landscape of the frontier. Epilogue. Years passed, and the ranch flourished. Rhett and Addie built a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with the quiet joys of a hard-won peace. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the challenges they had overcome, but they no longer defined them. They were a testament to their resilience, their strength, their unwavering commitment to each other. Rhett, no longer a gunfighter, became a respected rancher, a pillar of the West Creek community. He used his skills, his knowledge, to help others, to protect the innocent, to build a better future for the town he had once roamed as a solitary figure. Addie, her heart healed, blossomed into a strong, independent woman. She managed the ranch alongside Rhett, her days filled with the rhythms of country life, tending to the animals, caring for the garden, raising their children. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up under the vast, open sky of the West, inheriting their parents' courage, their resilience, their deep love for the land. The children were a symbol of their enduring love, a testament to the new life they had created together, a future free from the shadows of the past. Clara, recovered from her ordeal, married a local merchant and started a family of her own. She remained close to Addie, their bond of sisterhood strengthened by the trials they had endured together. Jed, the former outlaw, became a trusted friend, a frequent visitor to the ranch. He had found redemption, a new purpose in life, and he remained grateful to Rhett and Addie for their belief in him. Sarah, having left West Creek, eventually found peace and happiness elsewhere. She wrote to Rhett and Addie occasionally, her letters filled with a bittersweet nostalgia, a quiet acceptance of the choices she had made. As the years turned into decades, Rhett and Addie often sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors. They would hold hands, their fingers intertwined, their hearts filled with a deep and abiding love. They had faced danger, betrayal, loss, and heartbreak. They had confronted their past, they had fought for their future, and they had emerged victorious. Their love story, a tale of the wild frontier, had become a legend, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. One evening, as they sat together, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Rhett turned to Addie, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "Thank you, Addie," he said, his voice soft and husky. "For saving me. For loving me." Addie smiled, her eyes shining with a love that mirrored his own. "We saved each other, Rhett," she said. "And we'll keep saving each other, for as long as we live." They kissed, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken vows, a kiss that spoke of a lifetime of love, of commitment, of a bond that would never be broken. They had found their forever, their happily ever after, in the heart of the Wild West, their love story a timeless tale of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of the human heart. The vast, starlit sky above them, a silent witness to their journey, seemed to stretch out endlessly, embracing their past, their present, and their future, a future filled with the quiet joys of a life lived together, a love that had conquered all. The end.